Hello, students. This is Professor Gore, and this is the last recorded lecture for the conservative resurgence in the 1990s stuff. And this one, I'm going to be talking about foreign policy issues, as well as a couple of other domestic issues that are happening in the 1990s as well. So when Clinton comes into office, he admits that he came in to really do domestic reform, which is reform within the United States. He really wasn't focused on foreign policy, and foreign policy is going to be an issue where he is going to struggle. So if you look at H.W. Bush, who was kind of considered as really solid foreign policy president, struggling more in domestic issues, Clinton is going to be one who is going to kind of come in and try to do more domestically, but going to struggle more in foreign policy. And one of the places that he struggles is actually Somalia. Somalia is a country on the east coast of Africa that had quite a bit of political turmoil. You had constant civil war that was taking place, and you had rebel groups who were stealing food aid that was given internationally, particularly by other American philanthropic organizations such as World Vision and among others, the International Food Bank, whatever. But they were stealing it and then selling it for ridiculously exorbitant prices. And so all these different problems that were taking place, Bush sent in some peacekeeping troops along with some other UN countries, such as Pakistan was one. If you ever seen the movie Black Hawk Down. And Clinton had sent in additional troops as well. Well, there was a mission to go in and get one of these rebel leaders and capture him. But what ends up happening is these rebels shot down a Black Hawk helicopter and it crash lands in the middle of the city. And so an Army Ranger unit, along with Delta Force soldiers, are having to fight their way out of this conflict and to rescue those people. One of the pilots does get captured by the Somalian rebels, and I believe the United States is able to get him back through some negotiations and so forth. But Clinton ends up pulling troops out of Somalia because of the Black Hawk Down incident. And this is one thing that Clinton is going to get criticized for, because within the next 2 years, Rwanda has such terrible ethnic genocide. When the Hutus the Tutsi president gets assassinated, the Tutsis were a tribe within Rwanda that were more friendly to the Belgians. And when Belgium had colonized the area and so forth, and the Hutus were kind of looking for revenge, and they started committing ethnic genocide, referring to the Tutsis as cockroaches. And there's a great movie called Hotel Rwanda that really portrays this pretty well. It's based on a true story of this brave Hutu hotel manager who rescues a lot of Tutsi different people. And so Clinton had an opportunity to intervene in Rwanda. Some other UN peacekeeping troops were sent in, but they didn't really do anything. That's kind of one of the frustrating things about the UN. And so Clinton decides not to send in American troops because of what happened in Somalia. He didn't want another Black Hawk Down. And of course, in hindsight, the UN, a bunch of nations should have stepped in to stop the ethnic genocide that was occurring there, and so forth. Also, in Haiti in 1991, there was a military coup. And what's going to happen with the refugee situation is Clinton refrained from allowing Haitian refugees from coming to the United States. He feared it would strain welfare services and increase racial tension. And threatening a U.S. invasion, Clinton forced Haiti's military rulers to step down, and American troops maintained Aristide in power. There was this Haitian guy who took over after the coup until about March of 1995, when the UN took over responsibility for keeping the peace. Haiti has also been plagued with earthquakes and stuff quite a bit in the last 10 years. And so, anyway, the Haitian situation was a tough one. Here are some Delta Force guys. Of course, their faces are blacked out in this picture, who participated in the Black Hawk Down. And here's some of the Somalian rebels and so forth. Now, another thing that ended up happening that was another case of ethnic genocide, which was terrible in the 1990s, because you have the Rwanda genocide, you have the crisis in the Balkans, and you have Darfur and Sudan. It began in the late 90s, early 2000s. So you have a terrible case of ethnic genocide. But Yugoslavia was a country that had been formed post-World War I with the Treaty of Versailles. And there's a bunch of different ethnic groups in Yugoslavia, but the Serbs were the largest ethnic group, and primarily had kind of controlled the communist government and so forth. So when communism ends in Yugoslavia, you had other different ethnic groups who want to get independence. You have the Slovenes, who are eventually going to form the country of Slovenia. And then you also have the Croats, who are going to form the country of Croatia, and so forth. And so the country primarily of Yugoslavia was dominated by these Russian Orthodox Serbians. And in 1992, the heavily Muslim province of Bosnia-Herzegovina, and this province was primarily Muslim from the days of the Ottoman Empire when it occupied the area. Bosnia and Herzegovina declared their independence, but there was a substantial Serbian population who refused to live in a Muslim-run multi-ethnic state. Slovian Milosevic and his Serbian followers sought to make it their own Serbian state, and they began to launch a ruthless campaign of ethnic cleansing. And it really is terrible. They drove tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims and Croats from their homes, executed tens of thousands of men, raped equal numbers of women, and forced the survivors into crowded refugee camps. It was terrible. In fact, I taught a Croatian student years ago whose parents were well educated, and they came to the United States partly to escape that, and partly because she was born deaf, and she received these colloquial implants. It was really cool technology and so forth. And just a great student and a sweet family. So, but anyway, the Clinton and NATO feared a quagmire like Vietnam. And so in November of 1995, Clinton organized a NATO-led bombing campaign and peacekeeping effort backed by 20,000 American troops that ended the Serbs' vicious expansionist drive. In fact, I have one of my roommates in college, his father-in-law worked for the UN as an attorney to persecute crimes against humanity done by the Serbians. And so basically, the peacekeeping forces kind of helped draw a peace. 4 years later, a new crisis emerged in Kosovo, another province of the Serbian-dominated Federal Republic of Yugoslavia. Most Kosovo residents were ethnic Albanian Muslims, which Albania is another country, but were living in that part of old Yugoslavia. And basically, the Serbs want to drive them out of the region. And so again, U.S. and NATO intervened with aircraft strikes and military forces to preserve Kosovo's autonomy. What ends up happening is Milosevic gets tried, arrested, and tried for war crimes against humanity for mass murder. And so not good, but NATO does bomb the crud out of the Serbs for doing this. And you can see here's where Yugoslavia is. So you've got Slovenia, there's where the Slovenes live. You've got Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is where the main problems were. Sarajevo is actually where Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated years ago. Here's Serbia, and there is the Kosovo province that predominantly Albanian Muslims. You got Albania down here. So anyway, that's going to be a lot of ethnic tension there, and the communists were kind of oppressed everybody in the decades before, and once the communism gone, everybody's like revenge. So anyway, it's a bad situation. Now let's look at Islamic radicalism that takes place at this time. Clinton hoped to end problems in Israel when he met with Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, chairman of the PLO. Urged on by Clinton, they negotiated an agreement that allowed limited Palestinian self-rule in the Gaza Strip and Jericho. Unfortunately, a Jewish religious fanatic shot and killed Rabin for doing this. The new prime minister reverted to a hardline policy against the Palestinians. In 1993, radical Muslim terrorists set off a bomb in the World Trade Center in New York City. His name was Ramzi Youssef. And Ramzi Youssef is actually still being held in the American military base at Guantanamo Bay. But yeah, he did try to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. And he was kind of the first kind of Islamic radical terrorist that attacked the United States. 5 years later, Muslim terrorists used truck bombs to blow up the American embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. I think I said Eritrea, it was actually Kenya. And that's where the opportunity that Clinton had to take out bin Laden because they know he had funded this, and it doesn't happen. And so in 2000, Al-Qaeda suicide bombers drove a boat right into the USS Cole that was docked outside of Yemen, and it blew up a big hole in the ship, killing quite a few American sailors. And Clinton administration knew these attacks were the work of al-Qaeda, a network of terrorists organized by the wealthy Saudi exile bin Laden. But no one in the State Department, CIA, or Pentagon had yet figured out how to deal with Islamic extremists. And that's going to be an issue when we get to 2001. And this is about the bombing of Ramzi Youssef on the left, and then the bombing of the American embassies. Actually, the ironic thing is that these Al-Qaeda terrorists actually killed more Muslims in Kenya and Tanzania than anybody else. They were killing peaceful Muslims more so than they were killing Americans. And this is where the USS Cole was hit, and this is what it looks like it's getting towed away. Now, this right here is something that I will never forget as long as I live. The ruthless bombing of the federal building at Oklahoma City. Timothy McVeigh, an evil scumbag, in my opinion, because particularly where he set the van of explosives, he was kind of this anti-government radical terrorist that was looking for different government buildings. He looked at one in Little Rock, Arkansas. Actually, my parents had some friends who worked at that building that he could have blown up, but decided on the federal building in Oklahoma City. And he was an ex-military guy and put different high concentrated fertilizer chemicals and created this massive bomb. Parked the van right in front of the federal building, and what is gut-wrenching is he parked it right in front of the part of the building where the daycare facility is for the federal government employees. And so I will never forget, as long as I live, in 1995, when my parents are watching the news and they were pulling out these young preschool-age children out of the rubble who had died from this evil guy's act of terrorism. And so forth. And I'll never forget listening to on the radio, because this was it was on the radio when he was actually given the death penalty through lethal injection and so forth. And then also, but 2 years before this, in 1993, a cult led by David Koresh had this cult following called the Branch Davidians, had a shootout with the FBI. They were doing something with weapon stockpiles, and the FBI kept trying to get them to release the children because it was a group of families. And David Koresh was, I've watched a documentary about this, but he was having these other guys' wives sleep with them or whatever, and it was just kind of this manipulator and claimed to be Jesus. And anyway, the FBI ends up having a shootout with them. The compound catches on fire. They did release some individuals in it and so forth, but that's where it's outside of Waco. This is where you hear people call Waco wacko. But now the HGTV show Fixer Upper has kind of revived Waco and so forth. But that happened. And this is kind of gives you an idea of where they had different strikes and so forth with the Branch Davidians and the shootout. They also had some tanks. Anyway, now let's get into the LA riots of 1992, the last year H.W. Bush was in office. What ends up happening is an African-American man who was under the influence of alcohol got called into work. His name was Rodney King, and he was speeding fast to try to get to work. And police were trying to stop him, and he knew that he was under the influence and knew he'd be brought to jail, and he was trying to get to work. And so kind of on this wild speed chase, he ends up stopping. But what ends up happening afterwards is what sparks the LA riots in 1992. But police claimed that he was resisting arrest, and they proceeded to beat the living snot out of him. In fact, let me show you the after images. That gives you an idea. And so what ends up happening is the law enforcement officers go on trial and they get acquitted, and it sparks this outrage in LA where the beating took place, and a lot of different neighborhoods are attacked, and particularly actually a lot of Korean stores are attacked. And so you had this different violence. In fact, there was Korean store owners who were shooting shoplifters and so forth. And H.W. Bush has to call in troops to order martial law because, I mean, there were murders that were taking place. all this damage of private property, all this, there was mass looting and so forth because of the Rodney King beating. And then the next year, you end up having the kind of the trial of the 90s, the O.J. Simpson murder trial. And I watched a really good 5-part series on ESPN, O.J. Made in America, and it documents this whole trial. And it was like the most televised, watched event of the year was O.J. Simpson trial, and he ends up getting acquitted. And it's commonly assumed it's because of the police officer getting acquitted with the Rodney King beating and so forth, because O.J. Simpson was on trial for the murder of his ex-wife and her friend. Last name's Goldman. So anyway, but it's both events are tragic and so forth. And I even watched a few years ago, I guess it was 2012, and I think it was CNN was interviewing Rodney King, 20 years later and so forth, and how he's been doing and so forth, and recounting that. So anyway, it was both events are terrible, but they were kind of caught a lot of the national attention in the 90s, both the beating of Rodney King and the LA riots that ensued, and then the O.J. Simpson trial. All right, and that is it for the 1990s.